with much content, so I go straight away. In this presentation, I will basically talk about the 3 last decades and the changes in the business model in academic publishing and some of its consequences. So one thing that we need to be reminded before really digging into the content is that we have some major types of combination and configuration in academic publishing, depending on who owns the journal, the scientific journal, and who actually published the scientific journals. And we have 4 typologies of actors that may play both roles or just one of them. And they are learned societies, so associations of scientific communities and disciplines, for-profit publisher, non-profit publisher, and university press or universities. And again, we can see that there are different combinations. Most of the times you have a for-profit publisher which also owns the journals, or a learned society that plays both roles. But there are different combinations. In this presentation, I will mostly, but not exclusively, talk about this part, which is when the publisher is for-profit. And reviewing the literature, tried to identify 4 major phases in the recent history of academic publishing. The first is what we could call print era. The second is a concentration phase. Then we have an open access phase, which started around the beginning of this century, 2005 approximately, which is still rising and running. And finally, what I would call a diversification phase, where many things are happening actually in the last 7-8 years. Let's start with the print era, which we could say arrived until mid-90s. So the print era of printed journal is not over yet completely, because we still have most of the journal which have a printed version. But in the print era, we actually had all the major phases in the publishing and peer review process which involved something printed. Back in time, actually submissions and reviews were made by sending by mail, not email, a printed manuscript. And the same was when you were inviting somebody to review, you would send a manuscript, printed manuscript. So of course, these imply a rather slow, heavy system, but also, what I write, thoughtful. Meaning, if you have to submit a paper, you will think twice before identifying and choosing a journal, and when identifying a reviewer, you will think twice, and a reviewer not accepting to review will think twice, okay? Now it's much faster. In this area, we had a fragmented market, meaning that the big 5 for-profit publisher controlled around 20% of the market. There were a lot of many small publishers. And the business model, this is the first time I mentioned the business model, consisted in the so-called subscription-based business model, which means revenues derived from subscription fees of mostly public libraries buying the right to access and read the manuscript for their members. Let's move to the second phase, which started around mid-90s until mid-zeros. So in this picture, we can see the number of journals' new acquisitions over time. There has been since the 60s a process of very, very slow concentration of the market. But it peaked in this period. And you can see from the color of the histograms that most of the journals consisted of moving from small to big publisher, which is the red color. So we see a huge wave of concentration and moving of journals in this period. We can also see this from this picture. Well, in the red line, we have the market share of all the publishers except the big 6, or it's actually the big 5, the for-profit, but it includes in this case the American Chemical Society. So we can see that basically in a snapshot of time, between the mid-90s and mid-20s, I don't know how to say that, the market share of the largest publisher moved from 20 to more than 50% of the market. And nowadays, the 5 big for-profit publishers control 50% of the market. So again, this process was running already for a long period of time, but digitalization strongly accelerated this process. So in this phase, we can characterize the academic publishing, scientific publishing phase with digitalization. So it's a relatively quick move away from paper in most of the stages of the publishing and peer review process. The emergence of an oligopoly with the big 5 controlling over 50% of the market. But the business model is still basically subscription-based. So they still get the revenues mostly from subscription fees and very expensive fees from the libraries. Let's move to the third phase. So digitalization contributed to a virtuous cycle for the largest for-profit publisher. It was difficult for some of the small publishers to move to a digital area. For today, it seems obvious to open a journal online, but back in the 90s, it might not be that obvious. And also, with digitalization, you have zero marginal cost of reproduction, which means that large publisher can offer at a lower price a large amount of publication, and this gives them a competitive advantage, which increases their profit, they invest in acquisitions, and so forth. So we have this process of concentration. We can see in this picture Elsevier operating profit and margins for the scientific, technical, and medical division in a period of 20 years approximately. So this sector has always been extremely profitable if we look at the profit margins. But what changes in this period is also the absolute profit, the operating profits, which kicked up in around the 2000s and reaches billions only for Elsevier's. So one may wonder, why is this industry so profitable? This is often debated. Well, let me draw a parallel with normal journals. If we take a normal journals, we typically have an owner, an editor, which pays for the salary of its staff, journals, directors, and other staff, which produce the content. Then the journal arrives in the market, it competes with other journals, and gets revenues from the readers. Let's compare these with academic journals. In academic journals, we have typically citizens paying taxes to the state. The state pays the salary of the scientist. The scientists write the articles. They play the role of the editors, and they also reviewers. And this produces basically the journal. The state also pays for public libraries, which pay heavy fees to the publisher, and the publisher also gets some revenues from individuals that are not linked to a library and pay to access a specific article. As we can see from this picture, all roads lead to Rome in this situation. All the flows lead to the same subject, basically. And many journals actually enjoy a semi-monopolistic position because there is not perfect competition between journals. Typically, you have many niches in science, and journals try to occupy a specific niche. So myself, Frederick, when we choose for a journals, we cannot choose among 20, 30 journals. There is 3, 4, 5 journals. So this gave them a kind of semi-monopolistic position, which you can exploit typically for profits. So, of course, as the profits increased in this industry, there was also a movement 20 years ago of librarians complaining about the raising cost for public libraries and opposing to the merge. They didn't succeed, as we've seen in the picture before. the concentration happened. So, digitalization, both directly by providing a new technology and indirectly by spurring some concerns and unhappiness with the situation, so some political force that lead to the emergence of an open access movement at the beginning of the 2000s. What was the goal of the open access movement, as Doug explained it before? To basically reduce the barriers to knowledge in the internet era by enabling free access to scientific publication. And the defining moment which put really open access on the agenda was at the Budapest Open Access Initiative at the Open Society Institute, with the declaration for the use of digital tools such as Open Archives and Open Access Journal, free of charge for the reader. But, again, as Doug discussed before, open access is actually one term that hides very, very different systems. Let's consider 4 characteristics, whether the authors retain the copyrights, whether it's free for authors, whether it's free for readers, and whether it's peer-reviewed. If we combine these characteristics, we can identify the different arrangements that exist today. For example, subscription-based business model occupy this space. It is free for authors, it is peer-reviewed, but it's not free for the readers. Then we have preprints, which are free for both, but they are not peer-reviewed. We have a green open access space, which consists of self-archiving through personal web pages or public repositories of often articles which have been already accepted. And finally, we have what we call gold open access, which imply the so-called article processing charge business model. And I'm going to focus now specifically on these. So the gold open access implies that the authors, to publish, pay a fee. And these fees supposedly cover the cost of publication and some profit of the publisher. Now, the number of journals open access, gold open access registered exploded, as we can see from this slide. But gold open access also in this case, it's a term that covers different situations. We have non-profit open access, which include PLOS ONE, very famous and big journal. For-profit open access, for example, MDPI and Frontiers. And in both situations, these receive all the revenues from the APCs. And so it's exclusively APC model. But then we also have traditional for-profits and learned societies that simultaneously get revenues through the APC business model and the traditional subscription fees. And if they get both at the same time, we have the so-called hybrid model, which is very popular, and the so-called problem of double dipping, meaning that for the same article, the state pays, the public pays twice. They paid for publishing and for reading at the same time. So we have now a very heterogeneous configuration of gold open access. So in this picture, unfortunately, is a little bit small, but we have the cost of the APC running from 4,000 to 1,000 in this area. Their scientific impact normalized. Then we have the each dots is a publisher, and gray means hybrid, and gold means full open access. So we have a different price level and some relationship with the impact. Now let me make an interlude now. And I want to compare the two main business models in scientific publishing existing nowadays. So the traditional, subscription-based, and the emergent article processing charge business model. So let me reflect on some key logical connection. In the subscription-based model, the revenues, again, come from subscription fees of public libraries. Who is the client in this model? The client is the reader. Because we subscribe a journal, we buy a journal because we think that the content is of good quality. I will not subscribe a journal that I believe it's not good quality, right? So, in this system, the client is the reader, and the goal is to read good stuff. I subscribe a journal if I can read good things. The publisher goal is, of course, profit. We are analyzing for profit publisher, and they can get profit with more subscription, high fees and stuff. And you can get this by pursuing quality in the material that you publish. The key role in managing the journal, the editor, they are typically scientists. What is important for scientists is prestige and reputation. And they can achieve this by publishing high quality content. So in this system we have, in principle, an alignment of the incentives and motivation of the three main actors: client, editor, and publisher. To quality. So they have a common interest in a rigorous selective peer review process. Let's move to the article processing charge business model, so-called open access. But we have seen that open access hides a lot of complexity. The revenues. The revenues comes from authors who publish articles. So who is the client? The client, obviously, in this model is the author. Look also web pages. Compare a gold open access website, compare a traditional subscription-based. They look differently. The position of the client is different. The content is different. The authors, we know, have a strong pressure to publish. Nowadays, publish or perish squared. The publisher profit, again, derives from authors publishing articles. So, of course, we observed a huge increase in the quantity of the article published and the growth of APC publisher. Let me show you a picture which was developed by Gunnar Svertsen. Evolution in the largest scientific journal in the world between 2010 and 2022. This is the situation in 2010. They are all subscription based except PLOS ONE, which is a non-profit open access. How it would look like 10 years after? It looks like this. They are all open access for profit. And look at the numbers. Here the biggest one was 6,000, and then it's 20,000, 17,000, 17,000, and so on. 21 are open access for profit. 13 MDPI, 6 Frontiers, 2 Nature Springer. We can see also from this picture, which focus on publishers, well, everyone grows, but there are exceptions. Some, especially the open access, APC publisher exploded. Take MDPI in 7 years from 17,000 to almost 300,000 revenues from 14 to 300 million Swiss francs. Also, the traditional publisher actually start to like this business model. So gold open access, it's actually becoming the strongest way. The majority of articles recently became gold open access, not hybrid, not closed anymore. So very popular, started to be very popular also among traditional publishers. Again, in a paper from Gunnar and colleague, they comment in 2020 the annual revenues from APC among major scholarly journals publishers exceeded 2 billion dollars. And publishers find actually APC even more profitable business model than subscription based. So journals are chosen to a lesser extent based on quality consideration. So what are some risks of the APC model? Well, we have publisher profits, which derives from authors publishing articles. So a clear goal to quantity. The journal editors, as we've seen, it's scientists, and scientists care for prestige and therefore for quality of the material they select and selectivity. There is a problem. There is a clash of goals, quantity versus selectivity. So what happens in APC journals, the editors tend to be either less experienced academics or not academics anymore. You don't need them. They are actually an obstacle in this situation. So peer review becomes really a ficus leaf to the point that actually, if you look, most of the cases, publications are special issues. This is a picture which presents the number of special issues a year at NDPI. We have some of their journals which publish 3,000 special issues every year. Thousands of special issues every year. And you can see the evolution. This is 4 years ago, 5 years ago, and this is 5 years later. This is another picture. We see red dots means 800 articles with special issues, and blue is normal submissions. Again, we see a clear difference between for-profit, full for-profit open access, and the others. The only exception is BMC, which is for-profit open access, but it's controlled by Springer. So it's not exclusively based on that business model. So it's fantastic. You catch two birds with one stone. You don't do peer review because it's guest editor that will do the peer review of the special issue. And you publish a lot. Let's look also days from submission. This is also a huge difference between traditional publisher and the others. We have a non-profit +1, long peer review process, some have experienced, but it's non-profit. Then we have the hybrid, approximately 150 days from submission to publication. And then we have the for-profit open access, with MDPI an average of 37 days from submission to publications. Rejection rates, interesting, around 80%, 75%. So one chance on 4 or 5 publications to be published, with the exception of MDPI, which is around 50%, much lower. So, in a recent editorial I wrote with my colleagues that actually APC fits what Christensen defined disruptive innovation. So this is a terminology of this scholar studying disruptive innovation. Disruptive innovation is, for example, digital cameras. What characterizes disruptive innovation? They are innovation that make it much simpler and affordable to own and use a product for people who historically didn't have the skills or the money to be in the market. In this case, people that were not skilled enough to publish in the traditional model now can, much easier, very quick, faster, much faster, by paying. And another characteristics that share with the concept of disruptive innovation is that they typically start in marginal market segment. So the dominant organization at the beginning don't even realize that something is happening. But then, they catch up, as we have seen sometimes, if it's not too late. But they did. So this open access, full open access grew incredibly fast. At some point, the traditional publisher says, maybe we need to do something, we can copy this business model. And this is where we are now. Okay, so last phase is what I would call diversification, because we see several things going on at the same time. first, subscription-based model guaranteed a stable source of revenues, regardless of the publishing volume. You are subscribed, it doesn't matter, whether you publish more or less. But if you think on the APC model, this is very different. APC model requires that you constantly publish because you gain profit once, forever, only at the moment you publish. After that, you don't get a stable revenue. You can have published 1 million articles, but it doesn't matter. If you don't publish today, you don't get revenues anymore. So this is in a way a strong pressure on these publishers. They need to constantly publish and increase publishing if they want to grow. And the same applies to traditional publishers, which have been a bit moving in this direction. And so we have instances of publisher making pressure on editors to lower the selectivity and increase the publication volumes. I can share some anecdotal evidence, but you probably have this experience. Editors receive this kind of pressure sometimes, not always, luckily. For example, Wiley and Seeber came under scrutiny for similar situations. They were pressing editors to publish more, despite editors' rising concern about quality. And some of these editorial boards resigned and founded a new journal. So what we see is that journal editorial teams respond in different ways to these publication pressures. For example, so we have a diversification of publication practices among traditional hybrid journals. And I made some analysis on the business and management journal, for example. If we take the top journals, most of them, their size, their number of publications remained stable over time. But some top journals' size exploded very, very fast. For example, here we have from 2017 to 2021. The blue histograms is the top 15 on Web of Science journal in management, and the number of articles they publish, we can see it's kind of stable. But if we take the just 16, 17, 18, and 19 in the rank, they grew from 700 to more than 2,500 in just a few years. So we see also diversification of editorial boards responding to these dynamics in a different way. Another phenomenon is the growth of illegitimate businesses. We are all aware of the label predatory journals, which also share an open access APC business model, even more extreme, so they are classified as predatory. Then the definition change is debated. Some lists mention also big publisher in this group. And another phenomenon related to the explosion of quantity is paper mills, which is a term new to many. Paper mills is basically companies, mostly in some large developing countries, that develop articles, fake articles, they submit to journal, and once the paper is in advanced to publication, they sell the authorship, for example, with Telegram channels and so on. And we might think that this is really a niche. Living in Norway, working in Norway, it might be a very marginal problem. So it's interesting to look at the study done recently by some renowned scientists. They estimated that among 1.3 million biomedical Shimago listed, so it's Scopus, publications, they estimated approximately 300,000 of fake publications in biomedicine. So the countries, and we have some countries with highest proportions of these paper mills, around 40% of their publication in this sample, 50% are suspiciously the output of a paper mill. Another phenomenon is the diversification of the sources of revenues. by selling data, tools, and services. If you know somebody working for the library system in a university, they invest quite a lot of money in these kind of tools. And we work in these institutions, sometimes we are not even aware. To the extent that the revenues of Elsevier in 2022 came 50% from publication, but 40% from databases and tools. So it's already a very important business. Everything is moving extremely quickly in this market. Final important trend, which might deserve a separate section, is the so-called transformative agreement. Maybe no new for many of you. What is a transformative agreement? Well, I mentioned that there are two main problems in academic publishing. Rising subscription fees to read the scholarly literature and rising APC fees to publish in the scholarly literature. Last slide also of Doug. So transformative agreement emerged to tackle these two problems. The leading figure in this process was the Max Planck Society. In 2015, they wrote a report in which they declared the money already invested in the research publishing system is sufficient to enable a transformation to open access publishing. So they made a proposal to replace subscription fees with agreements for fully open access publishing. So we already publish fees, subscription fees. We make these subscription fees not for reading, but for both reading and publishing. So a transformative agreement is an agreement typically between a consortia of institutions from a country and the publisher to buy a large amount of APC discounts or waivers for a certain number of articles in hybrid or open journals. The supporters of this initiative were again ISAC, which is an initiative coordinated by Max Planck Library, and Coalition S, which is a consortium of national research agencies and founders from 12 European countries promoting open access publishing. Was it successful? Extremely successful, especially in Europe. This is the number of publications. In just a few years, it reached on 260,000 publications under a transformative agreement. So it's really 10% of the global production. And it's especially successful in some European countries and Nordic countries. So this is Norway. The majority of articles are already under a transformative agreement. And we have many other European countries, much less in other parts of the globe. Does it work? Well, it's maybe too early. I found a very recent report to the US Congress on financial mechanism for open access publishing of federally funded research. It's November 2023, so it's really recent. They write, there is little evidence that TAs are truly containing the cost. In one way, they accept and strengthen the current costly and opaque market for journal subscriptions. Coalition S, actually, one of the main supporters from the beginning, Coalition S, announced the end of its support for transformative agreement beyond 2024. Concerned that sustained support would make this agreement a permanent feature. Other critical comments, that's why I mentioned maybe it's an old wine in a new bottle. Risk of replicating the same trends and distortion that it was designed to alleviate. First, given the time and effort that you need to negotiate these agreements, they tend to favor large publisher and push small partner to go on the same wagon. Small peripheral institutions countries may find difficult to negotiate. You don't have much bargaining power. And authors are pushed to publish in journals covered by these agreements. Increasing concentration. I have an anecdote of a colleague in Ireland which was asking, hey, I'm going to publish this article. Do you have some support for open access? They ask it to the library, and they reply, no, if you want, you go in this journal which is covered by the agreement. Why we should waste money for, for APC in the other journals? So you see these working. Okay, last 3 minutes for some final consideration. Some challenges and possible solution for preserving quality and ethical standards. First, finally, authorities like funding agencies are understanding that open access is not the same. You know, you have a variety of solutions, and what we need is diamond or green open access. So what they are requiring, it's not in some cases open access per se, but green open access and diamond open access as a precondition. Otherwise, we have been spending a lot of money, part of the budget, to pay gold open access, which is kind of a paradox. We have to recognize that there are some open access initiatives very established, working sufficiently well in South and Latin America. So we need to maybe have a look. For example, Shello and Redalic, they are networks of journals already operating for quite a lot of time. Probably we need, especially we scientometricians, bibliometricians, take a close look to journal practices. For example, in recent journals discovered that editors publish a lot in their own journals, in the journals they are editors. Is this something we desirable, or we need to check? There are many aspects that we might look to monitor the quality of a journal. For example, do we observe a massive growth happening very quickly? Is there a high share of self-citations or citations from journals from other sectors? Do we see a lot of citations from journals of dubious reputation, or publication from countries hosting paper mills, or serial authors that publish constantly in the same journals, and so forth? I mean, if we sit around the table, we can find many examples of things that we might try to monitor. I'm an editor, co-editor of a journal. What we did recently is to venture into a pilot of transparent peer review, which means we publish anonymous peer review report of published articles. The logic is that this helps to reveal the quality of the peer review, that we abide to some standards for all our publications. It is much more difficult to do it for a predatory journal. You cannot publish probably the peer review report in such journals. It's a way to signal reputation and to enable research on peer review. Final consideration, and then I'm closing. Scientists are under pressure to publish quantity. In this system, especially in some countries, there are strong incentives to cut the corners, to maybe adopt opportunistic behavior, which erodes trust in the scientific literature and in science. We have observed a worrisome growth of scientific retractions and scandals. This is a comment by Oransky, which is the founder of Retraction Watch. When we launched Retraction Watch in 2010, journals were averaging 45 retraction a month. Last year, nearly 300 a month. So what could be some important measures? I believe it's tenure goals and promotion procedures that preserve quality over simply quantity, and metrics, with a close assessment of the most important publication. And in this respect, I think that Norway have a very good model in many regards. The process that is adopted for promotion in the academic system is considering a selected number of publications in depth. So this could be a very important measure.
Okay, thanks a lot, Marco. Very interesting and also a bit concerning, some of the things that you talked about today.